Welcome back everyone. In today's episode of Wuthering Heights, A Reader's Guide, we're going to be looking at Isabella and Edgar Linton. I'm going to approach the two characters here chronologically, starting with looking at how they are when they're introduced in the story, and then moving on and looking at how their characters differ as they develop through the story. Part 1. Civilization, Gentility and Thrushcross Grange. We first hear of Isabella and Edgar Linton from Heathcliff. Heathcliff and Catherine run away from Wuthering Heights and end up at Thrushcross Grange, where they see Isabella and Edgar through the window, in tears basically. And Catherine and Heathcliff, being the wild savages that they are, find this hilarious. Here is Heathcliff describing the scene of those two coming across the Lintons for the first time. Old Mr. and Mr. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We would have thought ourselves in heaven. And now, guess what your good children were doing? Isabella lay screaming at the farther end of the room, shrieking as if witches were running red-hot needles into her. Edgar stood on the hearth, weeping silently, and in the middle of the table sat a little dog, shaking its paw and yelping, which, from their mutual accusations, we understood that they had nearly pulled the dog in two between them. The idiots! That was their pleasure, to quarrel who should keep a heap of warm hair, and each began to cry because both, after struggling to get it, refused to take it. We laughed outright at the petted things. We did despise them. Right away this gives you a nice dichotomy between these two groups of children. Catherine and Heathcliff, without parents or any kind of guidance, are wild savages on the moor, completely brutal and bestial, completely self-reliant and brave and laughing at people who cry and can't deal with pressure or difficulties. Meanwhile, you've got Edgar and Isabella, who, confronted with a problem, just sit there crying for their parents to come in and fix things for them. In this scene, Edgar and Isabella are pretty much indistinguishable. They're both quite fey, weak, weepy, and submissive. But as the novel progresses, their characters start to change in very different ways. In the next part, I'll look at Edgar's character development, or lack thereof, and in the part afterwards, we'll turn to Isabella. Part 2. Edgar Linton, Stagnation. Edgar Linton, and we've talked about this a bit before, is the anti-Heathcliff. He's civilised where Heathcliff is wild, well-mannered where Heathcliff is coarse, and perhaps most importantly of all, passive where Heathcliff is active. In many ways, I would actually say that Edgar is the biggest victim in Wuthering Heights. I don't mean by this that the worst things happen to him, but rather that, as a character, he is just the most passive, and of all the characters, he rarely has the upper hand over anyone. And even if he gets it for about 2 seconds. Perhaps the first time that Edgar substantially plays a victim role is when he gets physically assaulted by Catherine. Now for most people this would be a signal to just leave that relationship or not even continue it at all, but Edgar still chooses to marry Catherine despite the fact that she's physically assaulted him. And this results in a very off-balance marriage, with Edgar being basically afraid of Catherine for the most part. This is what Nellie has to say about their marriage. I observed that Mr. Edgar had a deep-rooted fear of ruffling her humour. He concealed it from her, but if ever he heard me answer sharply, or saw another servant grow cloudy at some imperious order of hers, he would show his trouble by a frown of displeasure that never darkened on his account. Now, while some of Edgar's fears about upsetting Catherine tie to the fact that she's already by this point had one of her episodes, it also certainly comes from the fact that he is afraid of her. She's physically assaulted him and she is quite domineering as a personality, and Edgar is not very domineering and doesn't really know what to do with someone who is. There is in fact only one moment really in the entire novel where Edgar does stand up for himself. Not only does he hit Heathcliff, but then he tells Catherine that she is not going to see Heathcliff ever again. Unfortunately for Edgar, this all leads to some of the biggest tragedies in the story. Catherine has her second breakdown, and this is ultimately what causes Heathcliff to vow his revenge for the whole second part of the book. So even when Edgar does stand up for himself, he doesn't do it in a very smart way, and things go even worse for him. What's interesting about Edgar is that of the four characters, he actually stays in the novel for most of it. But after Catherine's death, he takes a real backseat in the story. He's there in a background capacity while Nellie is telling us the story of young Cathy growing up with him, but it really is a background role that he plays, and he doesn't do all that much in the story except fail to protect his nephew and then slowly wither away and fail to protect his own daughter. And this to me is where Edgar becomes the most weak. He has his moment where he stands up for himself when he hits Heathcliff and tells Catherine that she won't see him again, But then, after Catherine dies, all his fire goes away. He tries desperately to keep Catherine in the safety of Thrushcross Grange, never letting her go out beyond the grounds. He fails in this, she ends up going out, she meets Heathcliff, and he's unable to protect her from Heathcliff. Eventually Catherine will be trapped with Heathcliff when he marries her off to his son. Also, he fails to protect his nephew. Isabella trusts Edgar to look after Linton when she dies, but unfortunately, as soon as Heathcliff demands his son, Edgar just gives him up. He just tells Nellie to take the boy to Wuthering Heights and he abandons it and does nothing about it. And this really shows you how spineless Edgar is as a character. And it's also quite tragic because arguably him giving Linton to Heathcliff is what allows Heathcliff to make his plot to marry young Cathy to Linton and therefore ruin her life. And this is why I think that in many ways Edgar is one of the biggest victims in the story. He rarely acts. When he does act, things go wrong, and rather than try and fix the wrongs that he's made, he just continues to go passively along and ultimately fails to protect the second generation from Heathcliff. The passivity of Edgar as a character means that he doesn't grow or develop in the ways that other characters do. Catherine has a whole arc where she begins as a wild child, flips to the side of the Lintons, and then suffers for it. Heathcliff goes from a victim of abuse, someone who's fallen from grace as a child, been cast down by Hindley, to a creature of revenge, and then has his redemption at the end. Isabella, as we'll see, also has a big character shift. But Edgar really doesn't have this. For most of the story, he just stays the same. He's passive, just goes along with things, wants to avoid conflict, and doesn't want to get his hands dirty. And so of all the main characters, he has the least character development. He's just stagnant. Part 3. Isabella. Out of the frying pan, into the fire. Isabella's character arc is very different from that of her brother. She starts the novel as a basic background character, and for most of the early part of the novel, she's barely there, she just gets mentioned in a few scenes. It's only when she makes the decision to elope with Heathcliff that she becomes a truly, fully character in her own right. Before that, she's basically just the same as Edgar. Passive, weepy, and a bit pathetic. Unlike Edgar, who never leaves Thrushcross Grange and therefore never gets to develop and grow, Isabella leaves the Grange and she enters the world of Wuthering Heights, and in doing this, she's allowed to develop a personality. She's able to confront some of the darker aspects of the world and grow from that. That being said, when she first arrives at Wuthering Heights, Isabella is certainly still in the Edgar frame of mind. She's passive, scared, and intimidated by Heathcliff and the world of Wuthering Heights. Talking about Heathcliff to Nellie, she says, "He says he has married me on purpose to obtain power over him, and he shan't obtain it. I'll die first. I just hope, I pray, that he may forget his dialogical prudence and kill me. The single pleasure I can imagine is to die, or see him dead." At this moment, Isabella is basically a standard damsel in distress. She's in a terrible situation, and rather than think about a way to get out of the situation, she just wishes that she would die, or that Heathcliff would kill her. At this point, she's still in the Edgar frame of mind, just passive victim, not wanting to get her hands dirty. But unlike Edgar, who stays the same and doesn't ever fight for himself, Isabella eventually does. A couple of chapters later, when she meets Nellie again after having escaped Wuthering Heights, she says this, "I've recovered from my desire to be killed by him. I'd rather he killed himself." This line signals a really important transition for Isabella. She no longer sees herself as a victim, even if she has been victimized. She doesn't want to be martyred anymore like some damsel in distress. And that's why she says that she's lost the desire to be killed by him. She doesn't want that anymore. She's realized that actually what she wants is to get away from him. But what's also interesting about that line is that even though she's got over her desire to be killed by Heathcliff, she's not buying into the same cycle of revenge. Because she isn't saying, "I want to kill Heathcliff." She just says, "I wish he was dead." She doesn't care about how he dies, she just wishes that he would die, be gone from her life, because she hates it. And this is a really nice development for Isabella, because she found herself as a passive person in a terrible situation. She managed to come out the other side of that situation and not become a vengeful, bitter person, which is, what seems to happen to everyone else in Wuthering Heights. She also, as I said in previous episodes, has an opposite character arc from Catherine. With Catherine, you've got someone who initially starts off dominant and then makes a bad decision and fades into nothingness because she dies. But with Isabella, you have the opposite. She starts off quite passive and background, but becomes a force in her own right and is able to get herself out of the situation with her intelligence. Ultimately, there's only one big weakness in Isabella, and that's that Once she gets out of Wuthering Heights, she runs away. Isabella has her big confrontation with Heathcliff and all of the things that he represents, you know, nature, the dark side of humanity and all that kind of stuff. She has this confrontation and her response to that is to run away. And she does, and she lives a happy life for a while, but ultimately she does die. And then with her death, Linton, her son, is brought back into the fray. And so maybe Bronte is trying to tell us something about Isabella's death. You can't really just run away from these kinds of problems. You can escape them for a while, but you'll always be brought back in the end. In fact, this is something that I'm going to return to in the next episode when I look at Cathy Jr., because I think that she represents a slightly better version of Isabella, who is someone who has the confrontation with nature, but doesn't run away in the end. Part 4. The Lintons, Revenge and Forgiveness. In a previous episode, we already looked at the theme of revenge and forgiveness, but I didn't really focus on those themes as they apply to the Lintons, and so I want to do that in this video, because I think there's some interesting connections between these themes and these two characters, who represent different aspects of vengeance and forgiveness. Let's start with Edgar. One thing that I noticed when reading the book for these videos was how passive-aggressive and spiteful Edgar is as a character. It's hard to notice this when you've got people like Hindley, Catherine and Heathcliff who are just way more extroverted in how vengeful they are. But Edgar is just as vengeful, it's just that he is a lot more subtle about the way that he is vengeful and cruel towards other people. I think a great scene that shows how passive-aggressive and petty Edgar is the scene where Heathcliff returns from his first disappearance, and Catherine is obviously thrilled to see him back, and she's getting all excited, and this is what Edgar has to say. Catherine, try to be glad without being absurd. The whole household need not witness the sight of your welcoming a runaway servant as a brother. Clearly Edgar is embarrassed by the fact that Catherine's excited to see Heathcliff, and the fact that he just sees Heathcliff as a runaway servant rather than someone who kind of is Catherine's brother says a lot about his character and his jealousy about their relationship. But Edgar's pettiness goes beyond these little remarks. He really shows his vengeful side when it comes to how he treats his sister Isabella. Edgar warns Isabella that if she marries Heathcliff, then he will disown her, and true to his word, this is what he does. And while I can see why Edgar would certainly not want Isabella to be with Heathcliff, because Heathcliff is terrible, Edgar is aware of Heathcliff's character and how cruel he can be. And for him to just ignore his sister, to not even read the letters that she sends asking for help, is to me just way too cruel. That to me is revenge. It is Edgar basically saying that Isabella deserves the punishment that she's getting now from Heathcliff because she didn't do what he wanted. And to me, that just shows you how vengeful Edgar is and how unforgiving he is. And ironically, his vengeance there will ultimately cause even more tragedy, because in allowing Isabella and Heathcliff to stay together, Isabella gets pregnant with Linton, Linton eventually comes back, and then Linton will eventually marry his daughter and ruin his daughter's life. So once again, you have a vengeful person doing something, and this having terrible repercussions later on in life. Isabella, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of Edgar. Despite the fact that terrible things happen to her, she doesn't become a vengeful human being. And you can see this in some of the scenes that she has with Hindley when she's staying at Wuthering Heights. These two have a conversation where Hindley tries to convince Isabella to help him take revenge on Heathcliff. "You and I," Hindley said, "have each a great debt to settle with the man out yonder. If we were neither of us cowards, we might combine to discharge it. Are you as soft as your brother? Are you willing to endure to the last, and not once attempt a repayment?" "I'm weary of enduring now," I replied, "and I'd be glad of a retaliation that wouldn't recoil on myself. But treachery and violence are spears pointed at both ends. They wound those who resort to them worse than their enemies." This is a really important passage because Isabella is basically being the voice or the message of the story of Wuthering Heights. She's saying outright to Hindley here that if you get into this cycle of revenge, it's going to turn itself back on you. It's going to be worse for you than the person you're trying to get revenge on. And as you see with what happens with Hindley, he will eventually die and be completely ruined by his revenge. Isabella doesn't do this. She waits for the right moment to get out of there, and she gets out of there. She doesn't stop to take any kind of revenge because she knows that if she does that, then ultimately it's just going to go back on her. Isabella is a character who has seen what revenge does to people, and unlike, say, Heathcliff, who sees what that does to people and then does it himself, she turns the other cheek. She embodies that forgiving message that I said in episode 4, Wuthering Heights is all about. Part 5, Conclusion. In this video, we've talked a little bit about Edgar and Isabella Linton. I've argued that as a character, Edgar is probably the most stagnant of all of the main characters. He stays in the world of Thrushcross Grange, he doesn't develop, and throughout the story he remains passive. And it's this passiveness and unwillingness to act to protect himself and those that he cares about, which lead to his downfall, and the downfall of those around him. Isabella, on the other hand, is a character who begins in a passive state, but when she is confronted with Heathcliff, she fights for herself, and she gets out of there, and she doesn't buy in to the cycles of revenge that all the other characters seem to be consumed with. For these reasons, I actually think that Isabella is one of the best characters in the book. She certainly has one of the most interesting developments outside of Heathcliff and Catherine. And I also think it shows that Edgar is one of the lesser characters in the book. He doesn't develop, and he is pretty cruel. He's just cruel in a more subtle way than some of the other characters. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of Isabella and Edgar? Do you think that I've been a bit harsh on Edgar and his character? Do you think that he's a bit more sympathetic than I'm letting on? Let me know, I'd love to have those discussions with you in the comments. But that's it for this video, so until next time, ta-ra.